Well, hello. First, let me say, the very first thing I want to say is that this speaker has two empty seats in front of it, and the reason may be because I had to leave my seat over there because I found it so loud. So if anybody feels they're being deafened by the speaker, and if you want to move, do. Secondly, I want to say here we are. This is a 360. Which is a way of having a conversation which 6 Degrees has developed. It obviously has Indigenous roots, as you can see by the very shape of it. And around the table we have Anila Yuen, who many of you I think know. She's CEO of Calgary Centre for Newcomers, so is right in the center of the discussion about immigration and new Canadians. And then here we have my friend Leroy Little Bear, who, it always says you're a distinguished scholar. I don't think that's right. I mean, for me, Leroy is one of the most important philosophers in Canada. You could say he's one of the most important Indigenous philosophers, but actually I refer to him all the time. So he's a man of great ideas and great seniority in our country, and I think needs to be listened to. Chris Turner, who's a journalist and an author, and I think many of you know him. He's written about many things, about his son, about Fort McMurray, and many things. Then Sharon Butala, who of course is another old friend, and who's had over 30 years living in one of the most magical and difficult places in Canada, in the Cypress Hills, and a truly great writer, and magical books. And then it's a peculiarity of this system is that we have two people on mics, and they're not just people we put on mics to move them around. They're actually people to make sure that you have power. So one of them is Charlie Foran, who is the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and also one of Canada's leading writers. And the other, back here, is Martin Cates, who's on the board of ICC. He's a wonderful film producer, done many films which you've seen. He's also the president of the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television. And so that's the kind of structure of it. And we're just going to take a few minutes at the beginning to talk among ourselves. And then before you know it, Martin and Charlie are going to interrupt us with you. And then you're going to take part in this conversation. So what I wanted to do was to really just try and start things off a little bit and turn to Leroy, who's written, I think, fascinatingly about how... No, let me do it another way. I'm going to do it another way. You had the land acknowledgement at the beginning. And we all have got used to hearing the land acknowledgement, which is good and right and proper and polite and formal as it should be. It's an acknowledgement of the long history of this place. But I would say there's another thing about it which I think informs our conversation, and that is that you didn't all get up and walk out. So the fact that you didn't all get out and walk out means that you are willing to agree that you're willing to basically throw out the window the domination of the civil code and British common law. In other words, that you're willing to say that there's a great deal more to our relationship with land than merely who bought it, who sold it, who grabbed it and says they own it, and therefore nobody else has any rights on it. That you're willing to engage in a conversation about a relationship between people and place, which is far more interesting and far more civilized and far more complex, and which really relates back into the thousands of years of Indigenous approaches towards place and responsibility of people towards place, as opposed to people simply controlling place and getting to tell people what to do. So with that in mind as a kind of introduction, I mean, Leroy, you've written wonderfully about what you call the jagged worldviews, which I suppose is the roughness of what's happened as a result of these relationships. You've written about the holistic views, cyclical views, refusing the Western idea of time being the controlling factor, because it's, which means you're moving on all the time. And I'm wondering how, when you sit down, and we're here to talk about resilience, and you know what the history of the place has been, the thousands of years and the last 500 years. I mean, how do you think we should be coming at it?
What I've been telling audiences in the past 3 years, in other words, those people I've had the honor and privilege to speak to, I've been telling them, most of us, every morning, we just get up and we do. Yeah. But we never question the fundamental underlying metaphysics, philosophy, paradigms, however we want to call them, about those things that we do. And if we were to examine those fundamental bases, in many ways similar to people that are going through a midlife crisis. I've been referring to the TRC as an opportunity for a midlife crisis. Why? Well, because people with midlife crisis ask themselves fundamental questions. Who am I? What is it all about? And so on. See? And when they examine those, then they say, hey, maybe I'll do something different. Say. And the examples we've given are, somebody might say, I've been in this job for 30 years and I hate the job, but I'm stuck in it. I've got a house to pay, I've got kids to send to school. Somebody else might say, I'm going to sell everything and do something different. Well, but there might be somebody that'll say, hey, I love what I do, and I think I'll continue. But the point to be made, John, is that people stop and reflect. Okay. And in our society today, we don't do that very often. Okay. And that's why I say every morning we simply get up and we do. We never question those foundational bases upon which our doings are based. So reflection, for me, is the most important thing.
So that requires a totally different approach towards time.
Very much so. In fact, we should take time out of it. Because in Western thought, time is the most important referent. In our indigenous way of thinking, we're space-oriented, we're place-oriented. So place is where things happen, okay? And things are tied to the place, see? Whereas time is very abstract, you know? I can call home Toronto, I can call home Vancouver, see? But it's the time that really counts in Western thought. But in Blackfoot thought, hey, I could go elsewhere, but I always come home to the place. And it's the place where the stories, the songs, the ceremonies happen. And that's where our customs and ways of thinking find their root in the place.
I mean, I think this is, for the audience, I mean, you often hear people sort of saying, well, there are Western ideas and there are Indigenous ideas. This is a revolutionary idea that actually time is not the solution to our problems, that place and belonging are the solution to our problems. This is a very, very interesting possible way out for the West. Getting it from Indigenous ideas. I mean, now, Sharon, you lived those 31 years?
33.
33 years in the Cypress Hills, in a place which was really sacred land. And you wrote about it really in many ways as sacred land, I think, both technically and emotionally. I mean, how would you come into that conversation or this conversation about resilience?
Well, I think with reference to what Elder Leroy has said, one of the things that happens to people like me, elderly white women born in the West, is that as you get older, you lose that firm, rigid sense of time in the way that you're speaking of is natural. And I find that kind of wonderful. At first it scared me to death, but now I really like it. But as the person I am with the history that I have, and I can speak, I think, for all sorts of people, we too suffer in this modern world from dislocation, from the places that we came from. And there's always that yearning to go back. The only problem is you don't know where it is you need to go back to. I know for myself it's the prairie, but I came out of the bush, and sometimes I think that's what I would like to have. With reference to what we were talking about here, which was fascinating to me, really, really interesting, and terrifying because I'm in a room full of the most distinguished people, is that there is a new Calgary, even since I've been here, a Calgary where everybody isn't just like me. But given that I live in Palliser, which some of you will know, I rarely see anyone who's not just like me, unless I'm on the LRT or make a great effort to do that. And I would just say I'm constantly thinking, because I don't have kids in school, all of the places where there would be diversity, I don't see it because I don't go there. I have to try to figure out how to go out into that world or to bring people who aren't just like me into my world. And it's hard to do. I don't know how to do it.
And that's one of the divisions we're seeing in many countries between the sort of what the urban looks like versus the non-urban. I don't say rural because it could be many things. How do those, and maybe that's where some of the fear comes from, is people who are far away from the urban and don't know it, and the urban don't know them. Let's face it, increasingly, the bigger the cities, the less likely, certainly the kids in the cities are less likely to know what lies outside.
Oh, yeah, I thought you were going to move on.
Well, go to Anila. I mean, you talk about mainstreaming settlement, which I think is a really interesting phrase. This is all about finding language, ways to talk about these things. That's a really, really interesting phrase. And then you talk about how it's undercut in a way by unconscious biases, and how difficult it is to build allies, structures of allies, because those break down because people don't really understand their own biases. And then that gets in the way of mainstreaming settlement, I suppose. And then how does that relate to, the whole Indigenous history and the 500 years of history?
So in the work that we do, across settlement is to help immigrants not only settle into Calgary, into Canada, but also to be able to help the community welcome newcomers. So that's the distinction in terms of when I talk about mainstreaming settlement, it's getting the community that maybe has lost touch with their immigrant story, if they came as settlers or immigrants themselves, and also the role that the Indigenous community plays in welcoming newcomers, because it is still a part of the treaty, is that they retain, our Indigenous brothers and sisters retain the right to welcome everyone that comes here. And so a lot of the work that we do focuses around, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about is exactly what Uncle Leroy says. I say uncle because he's elder to me. So Uncle Leroy says is around space. And how do we build those spaces? Because in response to Truth and Reconciliation, working with the newcomer communities, we've seen that there is an almost instantaneous, oh, I get it, once we talk about Indigenous communities and circles and space and time, and not necessarily being married to that. And to juxtapose that with what Sharon's been talking about in terms of, well, I want to go back to this place, or I want to go back to this time. For our newcomer communities, there isn't the ability to go back to a time or to a time in that same way. And it really comes around building that space and being a part of that space in a new way. And where we find that some of the barriers to that can be is when well-intentioned people, including myself in different situations, all of us are willing to go a certain point. And then after that point, it's like, wait a second, now you're questioning my integrity, or now you're questioning how I see the world, and I'm an ally, right? So it's all about this, I'm here to help, where there might be some barriers to that get into place. And this idea of time is often a really big barrier to that, in terms of how long does it take for an immigrant to fully integrate into Canadian society, and do they absolutely need to fully integrate?
And what does that mean?
Exactly.
Yeah, fascinating. So I'm going around in a formal way, because then after that, I'm hoping you're all going to interrupt each other and talk to each other. And so, Chris, you said, I'm going to find this. You've talked about the high modern industrial triumph, and how maybe we're at the end of it in a way. But there's a very specific quote that I thought was fascinating of yours. You said, it's probably known to a lot of you in the room, so forgive me if I although I am partly a Calgarian, if I act the Easterner and I didn't know it. Calgary is a young city, stupid and headstrong, brilliant and bold, and it may embarrass itself again, but it will probably surprise you yet. And I think that's kind of a really interesting statement in the midst of all of this, because after all, the conversation we're having, it's a Calgary conversation, but it's only meaningful if it works not only for Calgary, but has some relevance to Alberta and is meaningful to Montreal and Berlin. There has to be something in this which has legs that goes beyond Calgary. So, tell us a little bit about how what you said about Calgary fits into this conversation about resilience.
And I think, first of all, the conversations about resilience in Calgary that I've participated in, tend to come back to moments of crisis and technical response to crisis. So the 2013 flood is a great example of that. Calgary might not even be having a midlife crisis. It might be having kind of a late childhood crisis. It's still not fully grown yet, and it realized, oh my God, we need to learn how to take care of ourselves here. But with the flood was an interesting example, because often that kind of self-examination you're talking about happens in these moments of disaster and crisis, and everyone's stories, or the vast majority of stories certainly that came out of Calgary's flood, was what an extraordinary, uplifting experience it was for the community to see itself as a whole and to realize that it had this strength to respond to this thing, without being told what to do, there was some very good leadership and that sort of thing, but everyone knew, I need to help my neighbors. I need to make sure the folks on my block are okay. I need to, if my house isn't damaged, I'm going to go find someone's house that I can help, clear out the basement or whatever. And I think that was a moment where Calgary realized that it was maybe stronger than it thought it was. I think in the day-to-day, Calgary's a very time-oriented, money-oriented city. People don't stop and take that much time to really think about what matters to them in the place they are. And that was a moment where I think it in a sense, almost discovered itself as maybe stronger than it and more resilient than it would have thought. And I think a lot of what I've been hearing this morning so far comes around to the idea of the city having the right pieces of a resilient community, but there being the sort of barriers that you're talking about, this inability to get all the right people in the room together at the same time to build on that thing that we catch glimpses of during a flood, during
Syrian crisis.
Yeah, these moments. You saw the same thing actually. Fort McMurray was a great example of that in the catastrophic fire there. The extraordinary sense of community. Among other things, just the technical miracle of evacuating a city of 80,000 people in a couple of hours with virtually no panic or loss of life, or there was one car accident outside the city. That was sort of it. And I think in each of these cases, in these moments of crisis, people do the sort of evaluation that you're talking about, Leroy. Unfortunately, we often then go back to normal life and can't get back to those moments of connection.
So I mean, that's the real question in a way. So, if you think about, let's take Britain, in a way, they're still living off their incredible triumph in the crisis of the Second World War. That whenever they get really depressed about themselves, they make yet another film about the Second World War to feel good about themselves. And they're great films, and it was a great crisis, and they did wonderful things. But, it becomes a way of not dealing with taking the time to figure out why you were able to deal with the crisis, and what do you do next? What are the barriers? And so, I mean, that's the thing I wonder about with Calgary. I mean, I think the Syrian crisis was very interesting because it had a lot of structure attached to it and went on longer than, say, a flood. Although the flood's pretty long, actually. The outcomes of it are pretty long.
And I think that with the Syrian crisis, it helps us in terms of kind of bridging from that kind of crisis place to kind of our aspirations for where we want to be as a society, right? Because it was kind of a mix. There was a crisis somewhere else happening, but it took the Canadian community to say to the government, really, right, to say that we want to bring in people, to have people come in. And in 22 years at that point of working in settlement and working with immigrants, I had never seen in Calgary that kind of community response to want to assist, right? We had like 1,000 volunteers ready to go, had no idea. Most of them did not speak Arabic, did not know anything about the Syrian community or any of the culture, but just said, how can we help? I think a lot of that was piggybacking off the cohesiveness that we did feel after the floods, but there was just this great sense of we need to do things. And we came together, and it was much more organized, and of course the government had things organized, and the community groups had things organized in a much better way. But I think that it's a good jumping point in terms of how do you move from always just responding in a resilient way to crisis to thinking about where do we want to be as an inclusive society and what are the building blocks that we need to do that. And we had our hiccups, of course, with the Syrian crisis, but it was a wonderful way where we had all of our Indigenous communities actively involved in welcoming everybody. We had community groups, we had different organizations, and people were taking initiative on their own in terms of doing things. They didn't have to be associated with the Centre for Newcomers or any other organization in order to do things. And I think that leads us to a place where we can start talking about what are some of the other things that we want to do collectively that are important, and how do we kind of use that kind of passion of the crisis mode, like we need to act right now, and build that into where we really want to be.
And what's interesting is that was, so you've differentiated, it's two kinds of crisis. One's the one that comes out of nowhere and hits you on the head. You might have known, but that's what happened. And how did you respond to it? And the ice storm in Quebec, and people have responded well, and those are strong signs. This is one where it's, in a sense, someone else's crisis, although it really is ours as well, because we're part of creating it, and you decide to become part of the crisis and to handle it. And it's true, I think across the country we did better than we've done for a long time. And in fact, one of the most moving things was the extent to which we heard small communities across the country saying, wait a minute, why are the cities getting all the refugees? We want our refugees. And that was a real kind of statement of strength, I thought. But what is it? So we're about 20 minutes in, and let's take just a couple of minutes, and then go to the floor. If you had to say really fast, what are the barriers you think to taking those steps, taking the time, taking the space instead of the time? Not thinking that we're driven forward and getting past the unconscious barriers. What is it we need to do? And we'll ask the same question at the end. So let's just go snap now. What do you think are the real barriers that we have to deal with in some practical or mental way?
Having the right voices, participate and be able to be there, they're beyond barriers of like unconscious bias and whatever else. There's practical barriers for people that they will cite, right, in terms of needing to work and needing to do these things and not being able to really be there. So I think there's the practical implications that can be a barrier.
I think, let's keep the conversation specific just to Calgary for now.
Yeah.
And the two things that the city is capable of doing that I've seen, which is to be both bold and humble, but to do that at the same time. So I think one of the things that certainly I pick up is that there is a sense that, even if this is kind of an interesting dynamic city where anyone can, you can come out and make, that sort of the Western ideal. I've heard the mayor say it a dozen times, no one cares, who your dad is or where you came from, you're welcome to come. But not everyone feels actually welcome. So is there a way that we can be bold in bringing people in who don't feel included, while not feeling, on the humble side, acknowledging that there are giant blind spots, there's things we don't do well, and that these other communities, these ones that have not been brought fully into the fold, have lots to teach us.
So name one thing that's not done well.
Well, I mean, the one that obviously leaps to mind is the way the city relates to the Indigenous communities inside and around it. I think there's some good intention there, but I don't know that's terribly well done in terms of actually feeling that that's part of the city, that those communities are part of the city.
And I think for myself as a person who doesn't belong to anything or have any concrete roles anywhere anymore because I'm an old person, I think it's personal. I think it's individual. And for myself, I was sitting in that group and enjoying it very much, listening to the wise things being said. And I thought, well, what can I do? I can do as I did last year. As I mentioned, I went out to Jane's Walk to walk with the South Sudanese dancers. Wow, that was fun. And went with friends, and that's one way to start mixing in. I think that I thought, what can I do? I thought I can start showing up for some of these festivals and celebrations of people I know nothing about in corners of the city I've never been. I can take friends with me. I don't know what'll happen next, but it's a personal initiative. Best I can do, John.
Leroy.
Yeah. My very thinking is coming back to what we were trying to explain in that article, Jagged Worldviews.
Yes.
Is that language is a very powerful instrument. Most of us think of language simply as a way to communicate. But in reality, language colonizes each of us. A particular language takes us down a particular pathway, say. And that particular pathway leads to what we were trying to explain as tacit infrastructures. In other words, unspoken ways of thinking. See? And we never question those tacit infrastructures that language makes us think in. See? So those are one of the things we need to examine. See? And out of those come things that we call social values, so that in Western thought, hey, time is a social value, bigger is social value, faster is social value, and so on. See, so we never want to think about, you're kind of hinting at it, when we get to old age, hey, we kind of get pushed aside, see. Well, in our native thinking, hey, our most valuable people are our elders, We hold them up on pedestals and so on. They're our libraries, so to speak. See, well, those social values are part of those tacit, unspoken ways of thinking. And that's what I'm getting at. And for me, that's what's very important, that we have to examine those if we're going to have a whole different approach to relationships.
John, is Charlie over here?
Yes, Charlie.
Charlie and Marty are now going to begin circulating the room, looking for questions and or comments. You don't have to have a question for anybody. This is a conversation. And the only ask is that they be 60 seconds or less and be, of course, on topic. We did receive our first Slido question, John. You can either pose it now or wait. It's entirely up to you. And is there anybody who's ready to contribute? I see one person over in
Let's go with some people in the room first, and then...
Great. All right. There's a here, and then Marty, maybe you can identify over there. And we ask that you stand up and identify yourself very quickly and then speak.
Good morning. My name's Afroza. Thank you so much for starting us off. I just wanted to respond a little bit to the idea of reflection, the role of crisis in self-examination. I wonder is it crisis? And when I think of self-examination, I'm thinking of reflection. I'm going to right now use the two interchangeably. Both words came up. Is it crisis, or is it who we encounter due to the crisis? In that crisis, we're encountering each other. And in encountering each other, are we deeply coming to know one another? Because you can respond to crisis and support and help and look at solutions and develop friendships, but do we really come to know one another? Because I wonder if we deeply come to know one another, we end up coming to know ourselves, right? That journey of encountering and coming to know one another actually helps me understand who I am, why I am the way I am, and what is it that I need to shift or perhaps orient myself around. And so that piece for me, I think, is difficult. That's the difficult part of coming to know each other. And I'm beyond 60 seconds, so I'm going to stop.
No, that's very interesting. Again, it comes back to the question of speed. Can you take the space that's required to do that, really? Where's Marty? There he is. Have you got... Yes. I know it's a little odd, but it's kind of fun.
Everything about today is fun.
Good.
It's challenging.
Good.
I'm one of the older ones, as being referred to. Okay? And frankly, I was too busy to have a midlife crisis. But I have lived. I'm from the prairies, and so I'm probably biased. But I've lived in Eastern Canada. I've lived in post-war Europe. And I'm related to the people around me in each of those experiences that I've enjoyed. But I've found something that maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that in the West, they judge you on what you do yourself as an individual. Whereas living in Toronto, it seemed to me that they judged you on what your father had done. And so I'm wondering what your response to that might be.
Thank you. Well, I would just say very quickly, I think Toronto has grown so fast. It's now 6 million people. It doesn't actually realize it's 6 million people. It acts as if it's about 2, which is why there's so many accidents in the streets and things. But I think that there's frankly, having been run over by a car not long ago, I think that there was a Toronto that was like that, where it was the Protestant Northern Irish Toronto that was exactly like that. I think there's a new Toronto. 52% of the population of Toronto, 6 million, was born outside of Canada. 52%. New York would be 33%. London is 33%. So Toronto is, I know it's terrible to say the word Toronto more than 3 times. I know I'm in Calgary. But Toronto is now the most cosmopolitan, in the true sense of the word, city in the world, because the majority of the population were born in another country. And they've had to learn how to live together. And so it's a very interesting place of instability, but I think quite interesting conversations are taking place that are surprising people. You know. So there was somebody here?
Yes, you want to take a couple more?
Yeah. Well, what's all right? What did I not answer? Well, what did I not answer? Huh? Sorry, say that again. So, if you didn't hear it, what the former chancellor is saying, is it former, or are you still? Doesn't matter. I'm joking. Is saying that Toronto still thinks that way, and Calgary thinks that they think that way, and I would agree.
Well,
I would agree. One of the big problems in Toronto is that there is no major organization set up in Toronto that doesn't call itself a national organization.
But I would say, in addition to that, there's a danger to Calgary's version of that story too. Which I think there is some truth to that, but it is also sort of a mythic story. You know, we don't care where you came from, we don't care where your daddy came from, that kind of thing, which negates the experience of people who come to Calgary or are from Calgary even, or you know, whose people were here before it was Calgary even, who don't feel like it doesn't matter where they came from or who their parents were. I think that is not actually true, and it kind of serves or can serve a narrative of the city that it's beyond that. We don't need to talk about race. We don't need to talk about gender. We don't need to talk about colonialism, these sorts of things, because that's not here. Those cities back east, you know, they're the ones who built their little fortresses. Here, it's wide open; anyone can come, and I don't think that's universally true. Certainly, people I've talked to, you know, who've had very different experiences from that say it was not true for them. So I think there's a danger in accepting that as a myth.
Absolutely, and I think that there's different pockets and different spaces and different places in Calgary where you're going to see that more true than in other places, right? And it comes down to what Sharon was saying in terms of you know, what your normal is, what you know and what you're used to. And so if we're not creating those spaces for people to interact and get to know each other, like one of the things that I always say is the most important, if you're trying to undo an othering of anything, well, introduce people to each other. Because once you can see that there's something in common, it's much more difficult to say that that person is an other or that person is different than you, right? So introducing spaces where people have to, being very, you know, urban planny about it, I guess, and, you know, and creating spaces where people need to interact with each other is a mechanism to be able to alleviate some of that to some degree. But there is also, being a born and raised Calgarian, you know, I don't want to poo-poo on everything that we've done, and, you know, and I am proud of some of that narrative. I am proud of that ability to still have that pioneering spirit and still have that Western hospitality. I'm proud of our history as, you know, with this really strange, you know, phenomena of the Calgary Stampede in there that, as most Calgarians, at least in my generation, grew up kind of hating and being like, I don't want to do that and I'm not going to do this. And then as we got older, went, wait a second, there's something that unifies us here that we can all believe into. And as you start understanding kind of the history of that, you know, at least for myself, I started realizing the Calgary Stampede in 1912 was the only place where the Indigenous communities could actually come and could actually legally, because they'd made whatever, you know, kind of, you know, conversations or contracts with the government for them to actually be able to practice. So I think that what we can do is celebrate some of those things and spread that narrative of who we are. I think that will help alleviate some of that othering.
John,
Can I speak?
Please,
can
Leroy,
I
yes.
speak to that, John? My thoughts on this idea is that we here in Canada, and if we wanted to transplant those into cities like Toronto or Calgary, is that we carry around this bumper sticker in Canada that we're very proud of. Unity in diversity. But the thing is, that unity, that diversity, I should say, we're speaking to, comes with all these different stories. talking about reflection, examining those foundational bases that we come from, we as communities or as a country have not gone through the exercise of synchronizing those stories, okay, that make up our communities, our province, our country. We have not synchronized. So we just have a whole these different stories. And I would say, especially for newcomers, immigrants, say, what story do I believe? What do I go with? And so on. Do I stick with my own story from the country I came from? And so on. It seems to me, if we're going to be much more unified as communities, as cities, hey, we need to synchronize those stories, see, so that we can tell one story, hey, we're all Calgarians, we're all Torontonians, we're all Canadians, see, but we have not gone through that exercise.
But does that idea of synchronizing, that's not the same as the idea of melting, of making the different stories disappear?
Right. I think of it as a hockey team. Hey, they're all different players with all different skills. If a coach knows how to use those players, that's synchronization, and they'll have a winning team.
Interesting.
John, we're at the 45-minute mark.
Yes.
So we're about halfway through, and we are having a conversation about resilience. What are the structural impediments to resilience? I think there's some of this culture of welcome, some of what Leroy just identified as very interesting in this regard. Like, are we having the right conversations? I'm giving this little halfway preamble in order that people who want to jump in now have sort of kept up with the conversation. And that's important. So we have had a couple people who are ready to speak. Are you still ready to stand up? All right, lovely. And Marty, then you have one? Okay, very good.
And I may point at some people, so, you know.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Miles, and one of the impediments I'm always running into is there's never enough time to fully talk about something. So with respect to the impediment of time, I'd just like to invite everybody to join me in the future with this project that I'm working on, and that's called Project Alberta. Now, the name Alberta has a lot of significance, and it's much too deep for me to go into it right now. But time, and the time to be able to reflect and share our creation stories. There's a joke that I heard a pastor once say that there's this guy in a flood, like 2013. He's on the roof of his house, and the guy comes by with a truck, says, "Get in the truck, I'll take you away." No, I have faith in God. And on it goes, and finally he's up on the roof, and they send a little boat, and he says, "No, God will save me." And then he ends up drowning, and God says, "Well, I sent you a truck with a guy, I sent you a fire truck, I sent you a boat. Why didn't you take those?" And to me, the First Nations is that boat. And we need to embrace the First Nation culture. And as Senator Murray Sinclair said, all creation stories are equally valid.
John, do you want to take that?
Well, let's just get a couple more from the floor.
Sure.
Let's,
Into the box. Sorry about in here. Yeah, just like that. My name is Surendra Kohli.
a little stronger, I think, a little louder.
Louder. My name is Surendra Kohli. Now, we were talking of identifying ourselves, but I think most of the people who come here, I've been here for a long time, but most of the people who come here, they come from various cultures, some great ancient cultures, who it's very difficult for them to lose their identity and to identify with what. We don't know what to identify with, because there are ancient cultures which cannot be, you cannot get rid of it. You know, it's a part of you. And so, I agree with the senior Mr. Leroy that time is a great factor in identifying yourself with whatever values, of course, retaining your original great values. You identify with whatever the local culture is. And so I think it's, someone was talking about amalgamation or dissolving in a culture. Well, amalgamation, dissolving, or whatever it is, that is what it is. It comes with time. So, but still the great question is, what do you identify with right now? So you have to be resilient. This is another thing. You have to be flexible and just try to accept whatever is good anywhere and retain whatever is good in you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to send the question over here.
I got it. Do I stand? Please. Okay.
And just identify yourself.
My name's Emily Albers, and my question's
Good.
my question's kind of directed toward Elder Leroy, but I think might be applicable to other people. On your concept of discourse, I think discourse really does hold a lot of power, whether it's looking at the historical evolution of some of the terms that we're using. But where do you think is the most effective way of changing that discourse? Or how can we change the conversation or the language that we're using to be more productive or inclusive? And where do we start? How do we do that?
And incidentally, the question here from Slido was, how does Indigenous reconciliation lead to building resilient communities? So,
Thank you for the question. Well, number one, I would say is we need to do that reflection. Reflect it that I've been talking about, so I won't go over it again. But we also need to have an icebreaker. You know how at gatherings and so on, people say, we need to break the ice, to get conversations going, so on. At our table this morning, we were talking about the arts. And the arts are a great starting point. We refer to it as the lubricant for relationships. And the arts allow us to transcend boundaries. So a very good icebreaker for better relationships is the arts. Plus, of course, what is I always refer to as that self-reflection. We need to do that individually and collectively. Yeah. Thank you.
John, we have one here.
Yes.
And then by me, yeah.
Hello, I'm Dessa Nguyen. I am a director here with my colleagues from the Asian Heritage Foundation. And
at the which, sorry?
The Asian Heritage Foundation is founded by Teresa Wu Pa. And I just wanted to ask Elder Leroy, we had spoken when we were ambassadors for some of the tables, but it's wonderful that we can sit in these groups and talk about diversity and talk about resilience and, synchronizing our dialogues and stories. But then at what point is it just kind of waving a flag in favor of multiculturalism and diversity? Because as Teresa, and we talk about this a lot in our board meetings, we run into the problem that this dialogue has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years. Diversity needs to happen. There needs to be greater diversity. I'm being a lawyer, like, you know, a lot of law firms, they like to use the word diversity, and then you kind of run into this tokenism where they say, okay, some of our clients, our big clients, corporate clients, will look to see if you have a diverse enough executive or board or diverse enough partners in the firm to give you that project that you want. So it becomes a dollar amount. And then if you don't want it to turn into a tokenism to just kind of put those people in front, then what needs to happen? Like, I know that there's the bill C-25 about how there's a recommendation that all corporation, major corporate boards need to be comprised of directors that are diverse, but they don't specify, and I think for a good cause, what diversity will look like on these boards. And there is a lot of pushback for it to become part of the law on the Canadian Business Corporations Act, to have that as a legal requirement of corporations to have a diverse board. But then, okay, if we're not allowed to, if people don't want that to be amended into our laws, then how are we going to go beyond just these conversations or this tokenism that diversity is good for money, right?
John, did you want to have the group address any of those
Does anybody
things?
want to respond to that? Well, Sharon.
Thank you. I have been thinking, you know, because of my own personal situation, so that I hear all this talk up here, and I'm thinking, but from day to day, what's really going on? And I'm saying, I never see anybody with a face different than mine. I was thinking that there are a couple of very thorny issues we have avoided, as you have just pointed out. One of them being that in the area where I live, and when all the women my age get together, the person who is revered is the one who can say, oh, I remember when Pump Hill was a farm, and my dad used to ride horses, you know, where the LRT goes, kind of thing. People who have been here for generations, and they're now beginning to feel they're the odd ones out. That's an issue. There was another issue. Socioeconomic class was the other thing. It seems to me that a lot of what we are failing to talk about here is the difference in class structure, a word we're not even supposed to say anymore. And yet, why is it when I get on the LRT, I can be the only white person in my car, and that's not unusual, unless it's during commuter time when the cars are jammed with folks like me. And I don't mean to throw a monkey wrench into the works, but I do think we need to think of these things. They're real issues, I think. Yeah.
I'm just going to inject something. I mean, I'm so thrilled you said what you've just said.
Thank you.
There's no question that in Canada, people hate talking about class. It's probably the thing they singly hate the most admitting. I mean, this is in many ways an egalitarian country compared to others, but still, class exists and it has real meaning in all sorts of directions. And I think it's never talked about. And never talked about in public meetings. Because if you talk about it in public meetings, people assume, well, you must be a communist or something to talk about class. Whereas the reality is it exists. You know, the numbers show it exists. And it has meaning. You know. So, sorry, Leroy, you were about to say.
Yeah, I'd like to, take a slightly different way of thinking about the comment and question. And that is, I'd like to go back to Maslow. Everybody has heard about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And let me put a caveat to that, and that is, I don't mind at all talking about the needs that Maslow talked about, because Maslow got those ideas right from the Blackfoot. Right here. Not too many people know that, but Maslow got taught those needs from Blackfoot people. The other caveat is that I don't think Maslow I mean, I don't think the Blackfoot taught Maslow those needs in a hierarchical order.
Right.
Say, I think they had more of a holistic approach.
Right.
Lastly, I think there was one thing missing out of those hierarchy of needs, and that was spirituality. Maslow never included that in those needs being physical needs, security needs, love, nurturing, opportunities for expressing yourself, if you want to refer to it as esteem and so on, self-esteem. And he ends up with this notion of self-actualization. What I'm leading to is, I just love it that those kids are running around making noise while we're talking here as adults, because you'd be surprised how much of that they pick up, either through ESP or something else. But those needs are the kind of things that will make us self-actualizing. And once we get to that stage, hey, that's a way to get past beyond just talking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think I can pick up a little bit on what Uncle Leroy is saying and be able to respond to you as well. Is I grew up in a community, the Ahmadiyya community. We're a Sunni Muslim group. And the founder once said, nations cannot be reformed without the reformation of youth. And that really resonated with me and has always stuck with me as a place when we, and I've had these conversations with Teresa many times as well, and having this, we keep having the same conversations and we're not moving the dial as fast, time-wise as we'd like to. And for me, I think the place where we can actually, a suggestion to move forward is really with our young people, with our youth, and being very specific around how we include our youth in these conversations, how we talk about our histories, and how we talk about globalization and what's happening right now. Because, having been a youth worker for, 20 years of my life, I know that little children can understand large concepts and can have really insightful solutions to them if we give them the chance and if we can explain those. So from my perspective, one of the ways to ensure that we don't continue to repeat this is to have those conversations. So maybe it'll take a generation, but it won't repeat after that, hopefully, if we're continuing to move the dial forward with the reformation of our youth.
John, we are at the 30-minute mark.
Yes.
30 minutes left. It's time for everything to speed up and everything to concentrate. I know of few people who want to jump in, but I also know that you have to ensure that we get out of this final half hour what we need around how do we, are there institutions, are there structures that we can salvage or that must be changed from the ground up if we are to build genuine resilience? That's the ultimate job of this discussion, to get there in some fashion, and then to try and include a few more people. What do you think?
So if I could go to Noved, who is going to be properly introduced this afternoon, but I think it'd be interesting to have you say something about what's being said here, and he'll be properly introduced, but improperly introduced. He's the elected leader, if you like, representative of the Inuit right across the north from all the different territories, and resides in Ottawa, where he attempts to get the federal government to do things. And that's the proper way to introduce you. But anyway, I just think it'd be interesting to throw you into this part of the conversation.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I wanted to just quickly just give us a little bit of perspective on resilience in Canada, and link that back to the origins of the people who were first Canadians. For Inuit, we say we are first Canadians, but also Canadians first. We have kind of tried to bridge that colonial mentality of that we have to fight against our colonizer forever. And we have tried to be strong, proud Canadians as well as strong, proud Inuit. But in these conversations, there is an underlying fear. There's an underlying perspective that as we become more aware of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights in this country, it goes against resilience for the country. And the natural resource sector has been the first to figure this out. And back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, much of the work that the federal government did was to try to create certainty for natural resource extraction. The modern claims treaty process is all a product of this idea of certainty. And certainty, yes, for political structures, but most importantly, for natural resource extraction. So in this time of reconciliation, if we are all saying that we want to get to a better place with Indigenous peoples, but we aren't willing as Canadian societies, as provinces, territories, or the federal government to respect Indigenous governance, Indigenous self-determination, if we aren't willing to think differently about our relationship on the things that matter, lands and resources, then there is something in our minds that always knows that somewhere along the way in the future of this country, there is going to be a reckoning, because we know what's right and we know what's truth. And in these conversations, we hardly ever get to those places where we actually can figure out how to have a respectful relationship with Indigenous peoples.
That's great. Yeah, maybe we should. Yeah, so Chris, I think you're right, Charlie. Chris, you could probably throw something in right there.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I think the point's well taken. That there, and this is one of those things when we talk about diversity too. That there's this notion that isn't entirely inaccurate. That if you sort of throw open the doors to reconsidering all this stuff, you're going to lose a thing that is very valuable, whether it's literally valuable in the case of natural resources and wanting to have right-of-ways for pipelines and things like that, and that those would be things that would then be basically taken back by Indigenous people with good legal cause in a lot of cases. But the concern there is, or I shouldn't even say concern, I think when you talk to people who work in the oil and gas sector, for example, in this town or in Fort McMurray or something like that, they express a concern that if this pretty enormous apparatus that they have built were to be brought all the way into the conversation you're talking about, it would be under deep threat. And they might not be wrong about that. And I think that's the part I would agree that we're not willing to kind of face in its totality, because it feels like it would put the whole project at risk to some. And I don't just mean
if you don't have the conversation, it's like going blind into an inevitable crisis, isn't it?
Right. No, I think it's, and I think so. But again, and that speaks probably to how difficult it is to start over in a conversation like that when there is a legacy on both sides. When there is, quite deservedly, I think, among Indigenous people, not a lot of trust in any of those processes. Not a lot of trust that they're being negotiated with in good faith for very good reason. It's very hard to even find where is that spot where we begin. And I don't have an answer for that, but I know that that's in the absence of that, time being money and all that, the industries roll on and do whatever it is they have to do legally to say they've done it.
But I think, and I will go to the floor, so I'm going to take advantage of and say I'll speak for you. I'm joking. But what Leroy is saying is that time isn't money, that in fact, by not taking the time, we're risking losing, and I think that's what you're saying as well, by not taking the time and having the conversation, we're actually risking losing the money. So it's the exact opposite of time is money. It's actually, you got to waste a lot of time in order to make the money and keep the money in the long run. Right. But let's just do kind of haiku, move into haiku. See how many people can speak really briefly, but just to get as many people on their feet as possible.
Okay, I'm Leroy. I live and work upstream from here in Canmore and Banff. And my question to the group is about the barriers to having people develop a really deep sense of place, and that arise with our market-based approach to people finding housing and securing housing, and people being able to say, am I going to be able to live here? Am I going to be able to find the kind of work that's going to sustain myself and my family here? And what does it mean to welcome people? I think we have a lot of we think a lot about what it means, that early stage of welcoming, but what does it mean to take responsibility for those whom we welcome into our communities, to be able to sustain themselves in those communities for generations and to build that deep sense of place that seems to be one of the things that we are having difficulty really building and really connecting to, and seems to underlie so many of these issues.
Thank you. I'm going to go
Very
over here.
interesting. And I'm sure we're going to come back to that, actually. Yeah.
Sure, Mike.
Do you want to stand?
Sure. It was a comment I made earlier today. Sorry, it was a comment I made earlier today about embracing the similarities of our uniquenesses. I think to some regard we fake diversity, but we do it because we're just novices, all of us. We put labels on us as human beings: LGBTQ, foreigner, not foreigner, newcomer, white, black, whatever, and then we define that as being who we are. We're not spending the time on a board or anywhere to get beyond the label, which should just be the opening door of, am I getting to know that person and their experience? Otherwise, we're faking it. And I think that's what we need to start doing. We need to see beyond the labels, beyond the uniquenesses, embrace them, but say, where are we similar? We will birth the same, we will bleed the same, we will die. We are human beings. Where does that come first?
Thank you. John, we have one over here.
Yep.
Okay, my name is Tim, and I'm from the same community as Leroy from the Blood Reserve, but I live and work in here in Calgary. And I think there is something to be said about some movements and some resilience that is happening in the Indigenous community. So I think across the country, we hear things around missing and murdered Indigenous women, I don't know more, Standing Rock, all this kind of stuff. And if Canada's origin story had turned out the way it was supposed to, then those Indigenous people shouldn't be here. But instead, we are creating movements of change, and we are creating movements, and we're coming in, we are attending in these spaces with drums and medicines and all that kind of stuff. So to me, that's a huge sign of resilience from the Indigenous community, whereas the rest of Canada, the non-Indigenous community who doesn't realize the disruption of that history would see it as resistance. But I think it's a huge sign of resilience, and so I think there's much to be learned in terms of how we manage to survive and thrive and continue to advocate and promote our truth. The challenge is there's a conflict of paradigms and beliefs. When we start to talk about our truth, we get asked the questions, well, what should I do? What's the solution? How much time do we need to offer before we can be reconciled? And the non-Indigenous community feels attacked, or they surface feelings of guilt and shame and all that kind of stuff. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we just need to be comfortable with entering into these uncomfortable situations and not lean on the Indigenous community to solve the problems, because the responsibility of change and reconciliation is the responsibility of everyone. The Indigenous community is leading the way because we have one world in our traditional paradigm, Indigenous paradigm, but we're forced to also have a foot in this Western way of working in it, and this infrastructure that was created that we are challenged by, but we've survived. We've shown incredible resilience, and so there's something to learn and be celebrated. It's not always about the deficit statistics. There's some real successes that are happening in our communities.
I think, it's very important what you said. It needs to be said, and said regularly.
John, do you want to
remind people of that? But
let's take a couple more and then maybe end it with the group. Okay.
I just didn't want to let that go by without acknowledging how important what you said was. Yeah.
My name's Colin. I work at the Calgary Sexual Health Center. And while I certainly think that resiliency should be celebrated, to bring it to Elder Leroy's point, when I think about language and what language does, language also shifts accountability, and it moves responsibility onto communities, and it takes it away from other people who have power. And so when I think of resiliency and what that term means, I think that it can be associated with strength, but I also think that it shifts responsibility onto people who are vulnerable and don't have power, and it allows people who do have power to go unnoticed. And so that's the name of this whole conference, but could you maybe address how we can overcome that obstacle? Because built into resiliency is the idea that vulnerable communities have to be stronger, which makes me uneasy.
One more, John, and then perhaps finish it. Oh, you want to end it there? That's fine.
Well, 2 more.
Can you hold to this
Oh,
afternoon? Okay. Okay, that's fine. All right.
Hi, my name's Corey Lee. First of all, I'm really enjoying the conversation that's being had today. One thing that comes to mind very clearly, though, to me, is I have a sister that does work for the Calgary Board of Education. And with the, us opening our doors, which we definitely need to do with, people from other countries, the biggest thing that she's having is a lack of resources. And maybe, I think you said something just earlier, is things will take time, and maybe the next generation will see that happen. But how are we really including and diversifying to ensure that, people from, say, Syria feel welcome here if they're not getting the support for language? When you have small children in elementary school, where are they getting the support? The teachers can't do it all. And from her experience, teachers are getting stressed out. And then that trickles on to what's happening in the classrooms. And then possibly maybe to the parents as well of these children. Anyway, that's just a comment that I have.
John, did we have one over here and I'm missing? Gentlemen? Oh, wrong spot. There you are. Please.
Fabeta is my name. I work for the Center for Newcomers. I realize we've been talking about some of those factors that really affect or hinder resilience. And we've pinpointed some of those factors that really makes what resilience is all about. But my question is, have we really understand what is resilient? What does it make a community to be a resilient community? In a multicultural society, do we approach resilience from a cultural perspective? Is resilience all about class? Is it all about an economic structure? What approach can we use to become a resilient community? I believe if we start to understand, we start talking about what resilience is all about. What does it mean to bounce back? What does it mean for that teacher who has that issue to understand a newcomer to pass across that message? What does it mean for a policeman who doesn't understand a newcomer to accept him or her? I believe if we start to understand these key issues of resilience, then we are able to strive or to thrive as a community. Thank you.
Very good. John, might be time. You have about 9 minutes left if you'd like to wrap it up with your guess.
Well, I was going to introduce, but maybe we've run out of time. To do it. I think what you said about ageism, and I remember it's an interesting thing to throw in about what is the nature of marginalized communities and how do you push them into the center. We've talked a lot rightly about Indigenous communities, and I think you hit the nail in saying it's the Indigenous communities which have fought their way back from 175,000 in 1900 to almost 2 million today, and incredible success stories. But there are all these, and your story about how do you change the boards, what do you do? And this is just from Sharon writing about ageism recently. We're not merely talking about older people, right? We're not merely failed copies of the young. We're a whole new class of citizens, which I think is a really interesting idea of thinking about people who are being marginalized by an idea that you have to be young. Or we talked last night about, your son who had handicaps and has to get up every morning and struggle. And I had a brother who was in a similar circumstance. And there's a community which is almost never talked about and has to work harder than anybody else to get through the day, and in that way are model citizens, but are not seen to be model citizens because they don't end up being prime minister, but they work harder to get out of bed, to make their contribution, to show. So there are all kinds of marginalities, and I think somebody was talking about how it was your synchronicities. How do you take these marginalities and make sense of them as part of a whole? And so maybe we should go around and just people say, we've had 90 minutes. What do you take out of this? What's your message to the 360 this afternoon that Adrian's going to chair? They're supposed to come up with the solutions. What do you think are the break points, the things that could turn it in a new direction? You've already said it, but you've heard other people. Maybe you have some thoughts that are slightly different now.
You're looking at me.
Okay. Why not? Why don't I start with you? Yes.
I think it goes back to, heaven knows and all of my funders know that, I would love to have an infinite amount of money to be able to tackle these things and to be able to get the resources for, our Syrian youth and for everyone else that's coming in. But I think that to move forward, it's twofold, and it revolves around relationships. And it's creating the spaces and inviting communities in to have conversations where they maybe necessarily wouldn't have had them. And the other piece, which I think is really difficult in our society of, go, and achieving things, is asking for help. When we don't have all of the resources and they're not there, and I need assistance at the Centre for Newcomers to be able to go out and ask maybe the unusual places, the unusual suspects that I don't usually ask, right? And say, well, I don't know anything about this group, but they seem to be meeting every Wednesday, across from my home or whatever, and and they get together. Maybe I can just ask them, this is what we're doing, and having those conversations, creating those spaces, and inviting people in that you never know could end up being people that want to participate in that. Because once you invite somebody in, they become part of the community, right? And then they start feeling like they belong in terms of wanting to do that, and that goes for anyone. Right? So if you're a marginalized community, or if we're a newcomer community and we're trying to work out what that looks like, to be able to invite people that maybe don't identify as that, to come in and say, this is our situation, how do we work on this together? So
great.
That's my 2 cents.
Well, I'll come back to the point you raised. So I have an 8-year-old son who was born with a very rare chromosomal disorder, has a generalized developmental delay because of it. We've done a ton of work with him, and I think one of the things that's a lesson I've taken from my experience with raising him and finding him the resources he needs is that there's a very big disconnect between community and institution, between the specific and the general. So specifically, my son gets quite a lot of good care and attention. We live in a fairly close-knit community, in a fairly close-knit neighborhood where people know who he is. They look out for him. The local school has done a marvelous job of including him, and the kids in that class with him take it as a point of pride that they include him and that he is part of their classroom, and that they help him when he needs help. But as soon as you go to the general, as soon as you get to the institutional level, if the point of all of the stuff we've created to serve special needs is to give the care and resources to special needs kids when they need it, it's an abysmal failure. And I think one of the things we need to maybe think about as we go forward is, can we interrogate our institutions in that way, in a way that doesn't get into guilt and shame and judgment and recrimination, and say, look, the intent was good. Remains good. The people doing the jobs in those institutions deeply care about the work they're doing, but the structure of the thing doesn't deliver the thing that we want it to do. And this actually, has parallels
comes back
with
to his original comment.
And with things like resource development in this country, we created institutions to do a thing that we now don't. The Natural Resources Canada and the National Energy Board and these institutions exist to approve energy projects and resource projects. That's what they do. So anything other than that is going to be an exception, and not the. And so, is there a way to genuinely rethink those things without it being a battle or a conflict? And I don't know. I don't have an answer to that.
Enlarge the imaginative discussion in those places,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not just yes, no. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm thinking about is, having taken the tack that I've taken in ignorance about many of the things the rest of you know, is what a Buddhist would say, which is that all change begins within the individual. And I know that I have all kinds of prejudices aside from my firm desire to rid myself of them, and sometimes I even think I have. And I feel that this applies to all of us, no matter who we are, or where we came from, or where we're going. That and coming as a Western kid, 77 years in this land, the issues that have always struck me as being more present are the ones I've mentioned: poverty, and a sense of the elite having, what's the word? I can't think of the word. Old.
No. A lot of stuff in your mind.
That was a joke. The sense of privilege. privilege is the word I wanted. And those are the worst prejudices, I think, and the ones that each of us individually have to struggle with probably all our lives. It seems to be in human nature. And I think that in having chosen not to be a melting pot, we made the harder decision. And it might be a better decision, but it's certainly not easy. But what I also took from this was hope. I think we're moving forward.
Elder Leroy.
For our purposes and to pass it on to this afternoon's group, I'd like to come up with a new bumper sticker.
Good for you.
And that is resiliency through diversity. Okay. What we need to get to people is to let them know, for them to learn that diversity is really about strength. In other words, people need to find value in the whole notion of diversity, because if they don't find any value, they may say, why should I do this? You know, why should I engage in this? And so on. At our table this morning, I was telling the group, if you took a fish and threw him out on the beach, and you threw me into the water, who's going to last longer? Okay? Most likely me. In other words, humans. And that's because we as humans have a diversity of skills. I can run a little bit, but nowhere near as fast as a jaguar. Hey, I can swim a little bit, nowhere near as good as that fish. I can climb trees a little bit, no good as near as that orangutan. See, but I can do a little bit of those. In other words, I'm a generalist. My skills are diversified. When I'm too specialized, hey, things are great when things are happening good, but if circumstances change, hey, there I go. See, and we can apply that to our economy here in Alberta. Hey, every government has been talking about diversity, see? But in the long run, we're still all dependent on that one oil well, you know, and so on, see? So the thing is, it really is the value of diversity that we have to let people know about, and for them to find that there is a value to it. See, if they don't see any value in diversity, hey, it will not happen. If I can give just one more example of that, and that is, if everybody had the same kind of health profiles, okay, and a disease comes along, hey, we'll all get wiped out. But if we had different and a diversity in our health profiles, hey, maybe some of us will catch it, but not all of us. There'll be a good number of us that'll survive. That's resilience. See, that's the strength and value of diversity.
Well, I have to say, having spent a lot of decades writing thousands of pages about the dangers of over-specialization, this is the best argument I've heard. So it's really very impressive. Yeah. So let me tie this up by just making a couple of quick points. You know, the decision, who was it who said the decision not to be the melting pot? Was you. Wow. It was a tough decision, because it was really the decision, and we don't talk about, this is what, we don't talk about these things. It's not about the United States. The melting pot is a completely European Westphalian idea that the Americans took. It's the European idea that a country has one race, one language, one religion, one mythology, etc. And the decision not to go down that road is a really tough decision because almost nobody is doing it. It's a really interesting decision, but we have to be very conscious about this idea that diversity is strength, and what do we mean, and how do we do it, and how does it function, and why are we reasonably comfortable with immigration. We really have to be tough and smart and clear about why we're doing these things, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, for 6 Degrees. So that's one point. The other thing is, I think that, it's got something to do with, I've forgotten who said it, was someone over here about the shifting of resilience to communities who were weaker. Was you? And I think it was a very, very good point. And in a way, it's tied to something else. Is that we all, and in Calgary, people talk a lot about, it's a volunteer town, and in crises, it's a volunteer town. But maybe the time has come to really be rethinking: is our understanding of volunteerism broad enough? Is it really inclusive? Is it really linked to the idea of, of the other ideas, Indigenous ideas, to the new communities coming in? Are they really being brought into the volunteer community really, really fast so that their experiences, which after all are really tough experiences, if you're coming from Syria, you know an awful lot about what's needed, and you're therefore needed in the volunteer community, not as a victim, but as somebody who's got ideas. And I think that's an incredibly powerful and important thing that I take out of the conversation this morning. And all of this is tied to something we all believe in, which I kept hearing again and again and again. We have to rethink the discourse. I mean, you talked about this. Everybody in the room talked about rethinking the discourse. If you don't get the discourse changed, we're not going anywhere if we're using the old discourse of time is money and so on. But changing the discourse doesn't get us anywhere if we don't do something. I come back to you. Sorry, I don't know your name. Tessa? Dessa, which is that you can change the discourse and you need to do it, but you still need to have the right rules, the right structures, and the right budgets. So that we were in a debate at the last 6 Degrees in Toronto about, how many immigrants, how many refugees. And some people are getting up and saying there should be no borders, there should be no barriers, we should take anybody who wants to come. And then other people, which would include me, are saying we should take as many as we possibly can, but we can't take people and destroy them. Because we don't have enough schools, we don't have enough hospital beds, we don't have enough structures, we don't have the housing. And we can't respond on our board of directors. We don't have the rules to make our companies work in an inclusive way. So we actually, the more people we bring in, which I'm in favor of personally, and I think our institute certainly is, the more we have to rethink how we're doing things. We have to agree that we need to have an awful lot more language teachers, and we need to train them. And that costs money, and that should be spent. And we need to have more schoolrooms that are more specific, and maybe have a smaller number of kids and do it differently. And we have to have different attitudes towards affordable housing. You can't just be grand and have a great discourse, say we're going to do this, without actually paying the taxes, putting the programs in place, changing the approaches in the boards of directors, and actually putting in place a structure which will allow these people to succeed and to become the incredible value that they are, not just financially, but emotionally and intellectually and ethically to the country. And I think that's kind of the atmosphere I was hearing around the room this morning. And I think we've done our job, so we can hand this off to the second panel and see if they can do as good.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you.